Imagine pouring hundreds of hours, thousands of dollars, and every ounce of your holiday spirit into creating something truly magical. Imagine the look on your children's faces as your home transforms into a dazzling, synchronized winter wonderland, a beacon of joy in the cold December darkness. Now imagine waking up to a crisp, white envelope taped to your front door, not containing a Christmas card, but a threat. Cease and desist immediately, or face financial ruin. This isn't a dystopian novel. This is Cedar Creek Estates, a seemingly peaceful suburban neighborhood governed by an HOA with a Grinch-sized obsession with beige conformity. And this is the story of Mark Harrison, a dad who just wanted to make Christmas special for his kids, but accidentally ignited an all-out war against an HOA president determined to ban Christmas lights. The fines? A staggering $500 per day. The crime? Excessive holiday brightness. Welcome back to Keys and Chaos. If you love stories about petty tyrants, neighborhood rebellions, and unbelievable HOA drama, you've come to the right place. Before we dive into the blinding absurdity of this story, let me know down in the comments where you're watching from tonight. It's always amazing to see our community stretch across the globe. Now, grab a cup of hot cocoa, settle in, because this one is absolutely electrifying. Mark Harrison wasn't just a guy who hung a few strands of icicles from his gutters. Mark was a wizard. By day, he was a specialized electrical engineer, the kind of guy who understood circuit loads and pixel mapping better than he understood small talk. By night, especially from October onwards, he was the Clark Griswold of Cedar Creek, but with actual technical competence. For the Harrisons, Mark, his wife Sarah, and their two kids, 7-year-old Lily and 5-year-old Sam, the annual light show was more than a decoration. It was a tradition. It started small, but as the kids grew, so did Mark's ambition. He wanted them to experience the kind of jaw-dropping magic he remembered from his own childhood. This year, however, Mark had outdone himself. We're not talking about inflatable Santas and blinking LEDs from the local hardware store. We're talking about a fully synchronized, professional-grade spectacle. His 2-story colonial house was mapped entirely with over 50,000 individually addressable RGB pixels. The roofline was sharp enough to cut glass. The bushes weren't just lit, they pulsated with color. The trees in his front yard were wrapped so tightly you couldn't see the bark, forming towering cones of light. And the centerpiece? A 20-foot megatree with a dazzling rotating star at the apex. But the real magic happened when the music started. Mark had programmed a 30-minute show set to everything from classic Bing Crosby to the electrifying riffs of the Trans-Siberian Orchestra. He broadcast the audio on a low-frequency FM transmitter so visitors could tune in from their cars. When Mark flipped the switch on December 1st, the result was breathtaking. The house didn't just light up, it erupted. Colors chased each other across the facade, snowflakes seemed to fall across the windows, and the sheer brightness pushed back the winter gloom. Lily and Sam stood on the lawn, bundled up in their puffy jackets, their faces illuminated by the glow, mouths wide open in silent awe. It was perfect. It was magical. It was, according to the Cedar Creek Homeowners Association, a Class 3 violation. The neighborhood reaction was immediate. Traffic on their quiet cul-de-sac tripled overnight. People came from neighboring towns, parking their cars, sipping thermoses of coffee and watching the show. The atmosphere was festive, respectful, and full of cheer. Mark even set up a donation box for the local animal shelter, raising over $2,000 in the first week alone. Mark felt a swell of pride. He had brought people together. He had created joy. He was the hero of Christmas. But every story needs a villain. And in Cedar Creek, that villain wore sensible shoes, carried a clipboard, and a pathological hatred for anything that wasn't meticulously manicured and utterly bland. Enter Eleanor Grimsby. Eleanor was the HOA president, a woman who ruled Cedar Creek with an iron fist and a perpetual scowl. She was the kind of person who measured grass height with a ruler and complained if your mailbox was eggshell white instead of the approved oyster white. To Eleanor, the bylaws weren't just rules. They were sacred texts, the foundation of civilized society. And Mark Harrison's display? It was heresy. The first notice arrived on December 5th. It was polite, but firm. Dear Mr. Harrison, while we appreciate your holiday spirit, your current display is in violation of Section 7, subsection C of the Cedar Creek Covenants, Conditions, and Restrictions, specifically regarding excessive lighting and nuisance glare. Please reduce the intensity and scope of your display within 48 hours. Mark laughed. Reduce the intensity? It was a light show. Intensity was the point. He assumed it was just a formality, a complaint from some grumpy neighbor that the HOA had to acknowledge. He ignored it. The second notice arrived on December 8th. The tone was significantly colder. Dear Mr. Harrison, you have failed to comply with the previous notice. Your display continues to violate Section 7, subsection C. Furthermore, the increased traffic constitutes a violation of Section 9, subsection A, disruption of neighborhood tranquility. You have 24 hours to remove the display entirely. Mark stopped laughing. Remove it entirely? It took him 2 months to install. He couldn't just yank it down. He decided it was time to talk to Eleanor face to face, neighbor to neighbor. He assumed that if he explained the joy it brought, the charity donations, the smiles on the kids' faces, any reasonable person would understand. Mark Harrison was about to learn a very hard lesson. Eleanor Grimsby was not
The confrontation
a
happened
reasonable
on
person.
a frosty Tuesday morning. Mark walked over to Eleanor's house, which was predictably the most aggressively beige house on the street. It had exactly one decoration, a small, unlit wreath made of artificial pine cones, hung precisely in the center of the front door. It was less a celebration of Christmas and more a hostage situation involving foliage. Mark rang the doorbell. Eleanor answered almost immediately, as if she had been standing there waiting. She was fully dressed in a gray pantsuit, clipboard already in hand. "Mr. Harrison," she said, her voice as cold as the air, "I assume you're here to discuss your compliance." Mark forced a smile. "Morning, Eleanor. Look, I think there's been a misunderstanding. The light show, it's just for the holidays. It's off by 9 p.m. sharp every night. We're raising money for the animal shelter. The kids in the neighborhood love it." Eleanor stared at him, unmoved. "Mr. Harrison, the bylaws are very clear. Excessive lighting is defined as any illumination that substantially exceeds the ambient lighting levels of the neighborhood. Your spectacle can be seen from 3 streets away. It is, by definition, excessive." "But it's Christmas lights," Mark argued, gesturing vaguely at the sky. "They're supposed to be bright. It's tradition." "Tradition is not a recognized exemption in the CC&Rs, Eleanor retorted. "Furthermore, the traffic you are generating is unacceptable. Cedar Creek is a private community, not a tourist attraction. People are parking on the grass verges, violating Section 4, subsection B. They are leaving litter, violating Section 6, subsection E. And the noise from the music, even broadcasted, is disruptive." Mark felt his temper rising. "Eleanor, we're talking about Christmas carols, not a rock concert. And we clean up every night. We haven't had a single complaint from any other neighbor." "I am the complaint, Mr. Harrison," she said, tapping her clipboard with a pen. "As president of the HOA, it is my duty to enforce the rules for the benefit of the entire community. Your display is gaudy, it is wasteful, and it is lowering the aesthetic standard of Cedar Creek." Gaudy. That word hit Mark hard. This wasn't just about rules. This was personal. "Lowering the standard?" Mark asked incredulously. "We're bringing people joy. How does that lower the standard?" "Order is the standard, Mr. Harrison. Conformity ensures property values. Your Circus Act threatens that order." She paused, looking Mark up and down. "You have until tomorrow morning to remove the display. Failure to do so will result in the activation of the penalty clause as outlined in the bylaws. $500 per day, effective immediately until the violation is corrected." The air rushed out of Mark's lungs. $500 a day? That was insane. That was $15,000 a month. That was extortion. You can't be serious, Mark whispered. I assure you I am very serious, Eleanor replied, her expression hardening. The rules apply to everyone, Mr. Harrison. We will not have our neighborhood turned into a cheap carnival. Good day. She closed the door in his face. Mark walked back to his house, the dazzling lights now seeming less like a celebration and more like a liability. He looked at the megatree, the synchronized pixels, the culmination of months of work. He thought about the fines. They couldn't afford $500 a day. They were saving for the kids' college fund. This could wipe them out. When he told Sarah, the color drained from her face. $500 a day? Mark, what are we going to do? We can't pay that. I don't know, Mark said, running his hands through his hair. It's insane. It's completely arbitrary. Maybe we should just take it down, Sarah suggested hesitantly. It's not worth risking our savings over some lights. Mark looked out the window. Lily and Sam were playing in the front yard, looking up at the infrastructure of the display. The thought of disappointing them, of letting the Grinch win, turned his stomach. No, Mark said, his resolve hardening. No, this isn't right. It's not just about the lights anymore. It's about the principle. An HOA shouldn't have this kind of power. They shouldn't be able to ban Christmas. He decided to fight. He spent the rest of the day researching HOA laws, reading through the labyrinthine CCMRs of Cedar Creek. The bylaws were vague, intentionally so. Excessive lighting was subjective. Nuisance glare was undefined. It all came down to the board's interpretation. And the board, unfortunately, was firmly under Eleanor Grimsby's thumb. The board consisted of 5 members: Eleanor, the president, 2 others who were her loyal cronies, equally obsessed with order and terrified of crossing her, and 2 newer members who rarely spoke up. Mark requested an emergency hearing. It was granted, scheduled for the following evening at the community clubhouse. Mark prepared his case meticulously. He brought photos of the display, testimonials from neighbors, records of the charity donations. He brought his kids, hoping their innocent faces might melt the icy hearts of the board. It was a disaster. Eleanor controlled the meeting with ruthless efficiency. She cut Mark off repeatedly, citing procedural rules. She dismissed the testimonials as emotionally biased. She argued that the charity donations were irrelevant to the violation. Mr. Harrison, Eleanor said, peering down her nose at him from the head table, the issue is not whether your display is pretty or charitable. The issue is whether it complies with the established rules of this community. It does not. The board has reviewed the evidence, including photometric readings taken by a professional consultant we hired. A professional consultant? Mark was stunned. They were spending HOA dues to measure his Christmas lights? The readings confirm that your display is 300% brighter than the acceptable limit. The fines stand, $500 per day. Do you intend to comply, or shall we proceed with placing a lien on your property? The threat hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. A lien. They were threatening his home. Over Christmas lights? Mark looked at his kids, who were starting to fidget, sensing the tension in the room. He looked at the board, their faces set in stone. He realized he couldn't win this way. The game was rigged. He packed up his materials. No, he said, his voice trembling with rage. I will not comply.
The next morning, Mark woke up already $500 poorer. When the sun set that evening, the lights flickered on, a defiant blaze against the December sky. It was the most expensive electricity bill he'd ever had. The HOA wasn't bluffing. They sent formal notice of the fines daily, delivered by a private courier service, adding the cost of delivery to his rapidly escalating tab. By the end of the week, Mark was $3,500 in the hole. The stress was immense. Mark and Sarah started arguing. Sarah, ever the pragmatist, was terrified. "Mark, we're bleeding money," she pleaded one evening after the kids had gone to bed. "We've made our point, but we can't keep this up. If this goes on until Christmas, we'll owe them over $10,000. And what if they do place a lien?" "They won't get away with it," Mark insisted, though his voice lacked the conviction it once had. He was exhausted. He was spending his days working his demanding job and his nights researching legal precedents, trying to find a loophole, anything to stop the bleeding. "But they are getting away with it, Mark," Sarah cried. "They have the power and we don't. This isn't a movie. Sometimes the bad guys win. Please, just take down the mega tree. Maybe that's enough of a compromise." Mark knew she was right. The financial pressure was becoming unbearable. The joy the light show had once brought him was replaced by a grinding anxiety. Every time he looked at the display, he saw dollar signs ticking upwards. But then he thought of Eleanor Grimsby's smug satisfaction. He thought of her calling his work gaudy and a circus act. He couldn't let her dictate how he lived in his own home, how he celebrated the holidays with his family. The neighborhood, meanwhile, seemed to be holding its breath. The traffic had slowed down slightly. People still came to see the display, but the atmosphere was subdued. The story of the $500 a day fines had spread like wildfire through Cedar Creek. And with the story came the division. Eleanor, realizing that Mark wasn't backing down, launched a subtle but effective smear campaign. She started circulating emails and posting notices on the community bulletin board, emphasizing the cost of enforcement and the disruption caused by the Harrisons. It is unfortunate that one resident's refusal to comply with the rules is costing the association significant funds that could have been used for landscaping improvements or community events. We must all bear the burden of this intransigence. The message was clear. Mark Harrison is costing you money. And it worked. Some neighbors started giving Mark the cold shoulder. People he used to chat with at the mailbox now avoided eye contact. He overheard snippets of conversation at the local grocery store. "It is a bit bright. Why doesn't he just take it down? I don't want my HOA dues going towards fighting this." Mark felt increasingly isolated. He had expected the neighborhood to rally behind him, to see the absurdity of the situation. But HOAs rely on apathy and fear. People didn't want to get involved. They didn't want to be the next target of Eleanor Grimsby's wrath. They just wanted to live their lives in peace. The darkness was closing in, both literally and metaphorically. Mark started turning the display off earlier, at 8 p.m. instead of 9, hoping it might be seen as a gesture of goodwill. It wasn't. The fines kept coming. He was down $6,000. One evening, Mark was standing on his lawn, staring at the megatree, the weight of the world on his shoulders. He was seriously considering cutting his losses, taking everything down, and swallowing his pride. It just wasn't worth it anymore. That's when Mr. Henderson, his elderly neighbor from across the street, shuffled over. Mr. Henderson was one of the original residents of Cedar Creek. He had seen HOA presidents come and go. He usually kept to himself, tending to his prize-winning roses. "Hell of a show, Mark," Mr. Henderson said, squinting up at the lights. "Thanks, Mr. Henderson," Mark replied, his voice heavy. "Might be the last time you see it." Mr. Henderson chuckled, a dry, rasping sound. "Grimsby giving you the business, huh?" $500 a day, Mark confirmed. "She's a piece of work, that one," Mr. Henderson mused. "Reminds me of old man Abernathy back in '98. Tried to ban basketball hoops in the driveways. Didn't end well for him." Mark looked at him, intrigued. "What happened?" "The neighborhood realized that if they could come for the basketball hoops, they could come for anything," Mr. Henderson said. He leaned in closer. "The thing about people like Eleanor, Mark, is that they rely on isolation. They single you out, make an example of you. It's easy to fight one man. It's a lot harder to fight an entire army." He paused, a twinkle in his eye. "It's a lot harder to fight an entire army." He turned and shuffled back to his house, leaving Mark alone in the cold. An entire army. Mark looked up and down the street.
The other houses were modestly decorated, a few strands of lights here, a wreath there. They were compliant. They were safe. But what if they weren't? The seed of an idea, dangerous and brilliant, began to sprout in Mark's mind. Eleanor had accused him of excessive brightness. She had defined the violation based on his display substantially exceeding the ambient lighting levels of the neighborhood. What if the ambient lighting levels changed? What if Mark's house wasn't the exception, but the rule? It was crazy. It was risky. It would require the cooperation of the very neighbors who had been giving him the cold shoulder. But if it worked, it would be the ultimate act of defiance. Mark Harrison was about to escalate the war.
Mark started small. He didn't want to spook anyone. He began with the Rodriguez family next door. They were young, enthusiastic, and had always been supportive of the light show. He invited them over for eggnog. After a bit of small talk, Mark laid out his dilemma. The fines, the stress, the impending financial disaster. "We're at our wits' end," Mark confessed. "Eleanor has singled us out. As long as we're the only ones with a massive display, she can claim we're excessive. But what?" Carlos Rodriguez asked, leaning forward. "But if the whole street looked like this?" Mark said, gesturing towards his own house. "She couldn't single me out. If everyone went all out, if we turned this cul-de-sac into the brightest spot on the map, what could she do? Fine everyone? Put a lien on every house?" Carlos looked at his wife, Maria. A slow smile spread across his face. "A light show war. I like it." "It's risky," Mark warned. "She could try to fine you too." "Let her try," Maria said, her eyes flashing. "That woman has been terrorizing this neighborhood for too long. It's time someone stood up to her. We're in." That was the first domino. The next was Mr. Henderson. When Mark told him the plan, the old man didn't hesitate. "I've got 30 years of Christmas decorations gathering dust in my garage. It's about time they saw the light of day." The rebellion began organizing in secret. They couldn't use the community email list or the clubhouse. They communicated through hushed conversations in driveways, secret meetings in backyards, and a newly formed private text group chat called the Griswold Guerrillas. The plan was simple. On the evening of December 15th, exactly 10 days before Christmas, they would launch a coordinated strike. They would unleash a blinding display of holiday cheer, the likes of which Cedar Creek had never seen. The enthusiasm was infectious. The fear that had paralyzed the neighborhood for so long was replaced by a sense of shared purpose, a mischievous glee. People started digging out their old decorations, buying new ones, borrowing from friends and family. The local hardware stores were stripped bare of LED lights, extension cords, and inflatable Santas. Mark, with his expertise, became the unofficial quartermaster and technical advisor of the rebellion. He spent his evenings helping neighbors map their houses, troubleshoot their circuits, and synchronize their displays. It was a massive undertaking. They had to work quickly and quietly. They installed the lights during the day, keeping them off until the designated launch time. They camouflaged the extension cords, hid the inflatable Santas behind bushes, and prayed that Eleanor Grimsby wouldn't catch on. Eleanor, meanwhile, was basking in her perceived victory. Mark's fines were now totaling $7,500. She assumed it was only a matter of time before he cracked. She continued her daily patrols, clipboard in hand, oblivious to the conspiracy brewing around her. December 15th arrived. The air was electric with anticipation. Mark stood in his driveway, his heart pounding in his chest. The street was dark, quiet, deceptively peaceful. His own display was on, as usual. At 7 p.m. sharp, Mark sent the signal via the text group, "Let there be light." The transformation was instantaneous and overwhelming. It wasn't just a few houses lighting up, it was the entire street erupting in a supernova of holiday cheer. The Rodriguez house burst into life with a dazzling display of multicolored lights synchronized to an upbeat Latin Christmas melody. They had inflatable reindeer on the roof, a nativity scene on the lawn, and a projector displaying falling snowflakes across the facade. Mr. Henderson's house was a glorious tribute to retro Christmas. He had unearthed thousands of vintage incandescent bulbs, the big, colorful ones that get hot to the touch. His lawn was covered in plastic light-up snowmen, carolers, and a slightly dilapidated Santa sleigh. It was chaotic, mismatched, and utterly wonderful. The Johnson family across the street had gone for a winter wonderland theme. Their house was covered with blinding white lights, with blue accents. They had an inflatable polar bear that stood 15 feet tall and a fog machine creating a low-lying mist across their lawn. Every single house on the street was illuminated. Some were elegant, some were chaotic, some were downright tacky. But they were all bright, incredibly blindingly bright. The sheer volume of light was staggering. The street was brighter than daytime. You could probably see it from space. The quiet cul-de-sac had been transformed into a dazzling, chaotic, beautiful spectacle. Mark looked around, a huge grin spreading across his face. They had done it. They had changed the ambient lighting level of the neighborhood. His house was no longer the exception. It was just one part of a much larger, much brighter whole. The reaction was immediate. Neighbors poured out of their houses, laughing, cheering, hugging each other. The sense of community, fractured by Eleanor's reign of terror, was instantly restored. They were no longer isolated individuals. They were an army of light. The traffic returned tenfold. People came from all over the city, drawn by the rumors of the Christmas Light War. The atmosphere was electric, a massive block party celebrating the spirit of the season and the power of community rebellion. And then Eleanor Grimsby arrived. She drove into the cul-de-sac, her sensible sedan crawling through the throng of spectators. She parked in her driveway, got out of her car, and stood there, frozen, her mouth hanging open in disbelief. Her beige house, with its single sad wreath, looked like a black hole in the middle of a galaxy of light. The glare from the surrounding displays illuminated her face, highlighting the fury etched into her features. She looked at Mark's house. She looked at the Rodriguez house. She looked at Mr. Henderson's glorious retro chaos. Her hands were shaking, her clipboard trembling. She expected compliance. She expected surrender. She had not expected a full-blown insurrection. Mark watched her, waiting for the explosion, but it didn't come. Instead, Eleanor Grimsby just stood there, silent, paralyzed by the sheer audacity of the rebellion. The war had entered a new phase, and it was about to get much, much uglier. Before we see how Eleanor retaliates, because you know she will, I want to take a quick second to remind you to hit that like button if you're enjoying the story so far. It really helps the channel grow and lets us know you want more epic HOA battles like this one. And if you haven't already, make sure you're subscribed and have that notification bell rung so you don't miss any of our upcoming stories. Now, let's see what the Grinch does when the whole town fights back.
Eleanor Grimsby did not sleep that night. She sat in her living room, the blinds drawn tight against the onslaught of light, and plotted her revenge. The rebellion wasn't just a violation of the bylaws. It was a direct challenge to her authority. It was an insult, and she would not stand for it. The next morning, the residents of Cedar Creek woke up to a blizzard of violation notices. Eleanor had gone nuclear. Every single house on the street received an envelope taped to their door. The charge? Excessive lighting and nuisance glare. The penalty? $500 per day, effective immediately. It was a bold move, designed to shock and awe the neighborhood back into submission. She calculated that the threat of massive fines would quickly fracture the alliance, that people would turn on each other to save themselves. She calculated wrong. The violation notices didn't spark fear, they sparked outrage. The neighbors gathered in the street, waving the notices in the air, laughing at the absurdity of the situation. "She actually did it!" Carlos Rodriguez yelled, grinning. "She fined us all!" "Does she really think we're going to pay this?" Mr. Henderson scoffed. "The HOA doesn't have the resources to put a lien on 20 houses at once." The rebellion held firm. They knew that their strength lay in their unity. If they stood together, they could weather the storm. They collectively agreed to ignore the fines, to refuse payment, and to continue the light show war. The lights stayed on, brighter than ever.
Eleanor, realizing that her financial threats had failed, escalated her tactics. She started targeting the infrastructure of the rebellion. First, she went after the traffic. She hired a private security firm to patrol the neighborhood, ostensibly to ensure safety and order. In reality, they were there to intimidate and harass the spectators. The security guards, armed with flashlights and an inflated sense of authority, started setting up roadblocks at the entrance to the neighborhood, turning away visitors. They aggressively enforced parking restrictions, issuing bogus citations for obstructing traffic and trespassing on private property. The festive atmosphere quickly soured. The joyful crowds were replaced by tense standoffs between security guards and confused visitors. The rebellion fought back, organizing carpools, directing traffic, and documenting the harassment. But the security presence was taking its toll. The number of visitors dwindled. The neighborhood felt like it was under siege. Next, Eleanor went after the power. She knew that the massive displays were putting a strain on the local electrical grid. She contacted the utility company, complaining about the excessive energy consumption and the risk of overload. She demanded that the utility company install governors on the meters of the violating houses, limiting their power usage. The utility company, thankfully, refused, stating that they could not interfere with the residents' usage as long as they were paying their bills. But Eleanor wasn't done. She started resorting to outright sabotage. One evening, Mark was troubleshooting a flickering section of his megatree when he discovered that several extension cords had been unplugged and hidden behind bushes. Another night, the Rodriguez family found that the air valve on their inflatable Santa had been opened, leaving it deflated and sagging on the lawn. It was petty, childish vandalism, but it was effective. The rebels had to start patrolling their own yards, guarding their decorations against the phantom menace. They suspected Eleanor, of course, but they couldn't prove it. She was too careful, too meticulous. The stress was mounting again. The rebellion was exhausted. They were fighting a war on multiple fronts against an enemy with seemingly limitless resources and a complete lack of scruples. The turning point came when the local media got wind of the story. A reporter from the city newspaper, intrigued by the rumors of the Christmas light war and the $500 a day fines, decided to investigate. The resulting article, titled "The HOA That Banned Christmas, Cedar Creek's War on Winter Wonderland," was a sensation. It painted a vivid picture of the dazzling light displays, the defiant residents, and the tyrannical HOA president obsessed with beige conformity. The article went viral. It was shared on social media and discussed on talk shows. Cedar Creek became famous, or rather infamous. The public opinion was overwhelmingly on the side of the rebellion. People were outraged by the HOA's heavy-handed tactics, the exorbitant fines, and the sheer pettiness of the situation. Donations poured in to a legal defense fund set up by the residents. Offers of free lights and decorations came from all over the country. Eleanor Grimsby found herself in the spotlight, and it was not flattering. She was portrayed as a Grinch, a Karen, a petty tyrant drunk on power. She received angry emails, phone calls, and even threats. The HOA board, realizing that they were facing a public relations disaster, started to panic. The two newer members, who had previously been silent, started questioning Eleanor's leadership. They demanded an emergency meeting to address the crisis. Eleanor, cornered and desperate, knew she had to regain control of the narrative. She agreed to the meeting, planning to use it as a platform to defend her actions and crush the rebellion once and for all. But the rebellion had a secret weapon of their own. Mr. Henderson, the old-timer who knew the history of Cedar Creek better than anyone, had been busy doing some research, and he had found something interesting. Something buried deep in the archives of the HOA bylaws.
While the street was ablaze with light and the media circus swirled around them, Mr. Henderson had retreated to the quiet confines of his study. He was a man who understood the value of fine print. Having lived in Cedar Creek since its inception, he possessed a complete archive of every CC&R update, every amendment, and every meeting minute since the HOA was founded. He spent days poring over the documents, fueled by black coffee and a growing sense of indignation. He was looking for a weakness in the Grimsby Doctrine, a flaw in the armor of the bylaws she wielded like a weapon. And he found it. Not in the current bylaws, but in an amendment passed 15 years prior, during a brief period when the HOA had been led by a more liberal administration. The amendment was related to temporary community events and displays. It stated that the HOA board could grant exemptions to the standard rules regarding lighting, noise, and traffic for events deemed to be in the interest of community cohesion and charitable endeavors. The exemption required a petition signed by a majority of the residents in the affected area and approval by the board. It was a long shot. Eleanor controlled the board. She would never approve the exemption. But the existence of the amendment itself was significant. It proved that the bylaws were not immutable, that exceptions could be made for the sake of the community. Mr. Henderson brought his findings to Mark and the rest of the Griswold guerrillas. "She's been citing Section 7, subsection C against us, the excessive lighting rule," Mr. Henderson explained, tapping the photocopied document. "But this amendment, Article 12, provides a mechanism for overriding that rule." "But she'll never approve it," Mark said, skeptical. "Even if we get the signatures, she'll just veto it." "Perhaps," Mr. Henderson conceded. "But that's where the second part of the plan comes in. We're not just asking for an exemption, we're calling for a vote of no confidence in the president." The HOA bylaws also contained a provision for the removal of a board member, including the president, by a majority vote of the homeowners at a special meeting called for that purpose. The meeting required a quorum of 50% of the homeowners. The rebellion realized they had a path to victory. They didn't just have to fight the fines, they could fight the source of the fines. They could overthrow the tyrant. The plan was set. They would use the upcoming emergency meeting, the one called by the panicked board members, as the stage for their coup. The next few days were a frenzy of activity. The rebellion mobilized, going door to door, canvassing the entire neighborhood of Cedar Creek, not just their own street. They presented their case, armed with the media coverage, the evidence of Eleanor's sabotage. They had finally caught her unplugging cords on a security camera, and the promise of a return to sanity. It wasn't easy. Cedar Creek had 200 homes. They needed 101 to reach a quorum, and a majority of those present to vote Eleanor out. Many residents were still hesitant, afraid of rocking the boat. Others were loyal to Eleanor, believing that her strict enforcement of the rules protected their property values. But the tide had turned. The Christmas light war had exposed the absurdity of the HOA's tyranny. People were tired of the constant surveillance, the petty fines, the atmosphere of fear. They wanted their neighborhood back. The night of the emergency meeting arrived. The community clubhouse was packed. The tension in the room was palpable. The rebellion had managed to secure a quorum, and then some. Over 150 homeowners were present, a record turnout for an HOA meeting. Eleanor Grimsby sat at the head table, flanked by the other board members. She looked pale and drawn. The stress of the past few weeks was clearly taking its toll, but her expression was still defiant, her posture rigid. She opened the meeting with a prepared statement, attempting to regain control of the narrative. "Welcome," she began, her voice trembling slightly. "I want to emphasize that the board's actions, while perhaps unpopular, have been necessary to enforce the rules and protect the interests of all homeowners." She went on to decry the anarchy of the light show war, the disrespect for authority, and the negative impact of the media attention. She painted herself as a victim, a dedicated public servant under siege by a mob of unruly residents. It was a masterful performance, full of self-pity and righteous indignation. But it was falling on deaf ears. The crowd was restless, impatient. When she finished, Mark stood up. He had been designated as the spokesperson for the rebellion. "Thank you, Madam President," he began, his voice clear and steady. "We appreciate your perspective,
but we believe that the recent events have exposed a fundamental problem in our community. A problem not with the rules themselves, but with how they are enforced. He went on to detail the history of the conflict, the initial joy of the light show, the exorbitant fines, the smear campaign, the sabotage. He spoke about the power of community, the spirit of the season, and the importance of common sense. Then he brought out the amendment. The bylaws provide a mechanism for exceptions, he said, holding up the document. Article 12 allows for temporary community events and displays that promote community cohesion and charitable endeavors. We believe that the Christmas light show qualifies for such an exemption. He presented a petition signed by over 70% of the residents of Cedar Creek requesting the exemption. Eleanor scoffed. "This is irrelevant. The board has the final authority to approve or deny exemptions, and I assure you, this board will not approve this circus." "That brings us to our second point," Mark continued, unfazed. "We believe that your leadership has been detrimental to the community. Your arbitrary enforcement of the rules, your abuse of power, and your refusal to listen to the concerns of the residents have created an atmosphere of fear and division." He paused, looking around the room. "Therefore, we are calling for a vote of no confidence in President Eleanor Grimsby and demanding her immediate removal from the board." The room erupted in cheers and applause. Eleanor slammed her gavel on the table, her face red with fury. "Order!" she shrieked. "Order! This is preposterous! You have no authority to call for such a vote." "Actually, we do," Mr. Henderson said, standing up slowly. "Section 5, Article 3 of the bylaws. A board member may be removed with or without cause by a majority vote of the homeowners present at a special meeting called for that purpose." He smiled faintly. "And this, Madam President, is a special meeting." Eleanor stared at him, speechless. She had been outmaneuvered, hoisted by her own petard. The bylaws she had worshipped for so long had become the instrument of her downfall.
The room exploded. The celebration was instantaneous, a release of months of pent-up frustration and anxiety. Neighbors hugged each other, tears streaming down their faces. The tyranny of beige was over. Eleanor Grimsby sat at the head table, frozen, paralyzed by the shock of the defeat. Her face was ashen, her eyes wide with disbelief. Her world, built on order, control, and the meticulous enforcement of bylaws, had crumbled around her. The remaining board members, sensing the shift in power, quickly distanced themselves from her. The vice president took over the meeting, his voice trembling slightly as he formally acknowledged the result of the vote. "The motion carries. Eleanor Grimsby is hereby removed from the board, effective immediately." He turned to Eleanor. "Miss Grimsby, please surrender your keys, your clipboard, and all HOA documents in your possession." Eleanor didn't move. She just stared straight ahead, her mind unable to process the reality of the situation. The crowd started chanting, "Out! Out! Out!" The atmosphere, once celebratory, was turning ugly. Mark felt a pang of pity for her. She was a tyrant, yes, but she was also a human being, humiliated and broken. He walked up to the head table, signaling for the crowd to quiet down. "Eleanor," he said gently, "it's over. It's time to go." Eleanor looked at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of hatred and despair. "You did this," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "You ruined everything. You destroyed this neighborhood." "We saved this neighborhood, Eleanor. We brought it back to life." "Life?" she scoffed, her voice rising hysterically. "This isn't life. This is chaos. This is anarchy. This is... She trailed off, her eyes drawn to the window. Outside, the street was ablaze with light. the dazzling displays reflecting in the darkness. The sound of music and laughter drifted in from the street. "It's so gaudy," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. "So wasteful, so excessive." "Why, Eleanor?" Mark asked, genuinely curious. "Why do you hate it so much? It's just Christmas lights. It's supposed to be joyful."
Eleanor stared at the lights, her expression softening for a moment. A flicker of something akin to longing crossed her face. And then the mask dropped. "Because I can't do it!" she suddenly burst out, tears streaming down her face. "Because I don't know how!" The room fell silent, stunned by the confession. "I tried," she sobbed, the words rushing out in a torrent of suppressed emotion. "Every year I tried. I bought the lights, the decorations, but it never looked right. It always looked messy, cluttered, chaotic. My husband used to say I had no eye for design, no sense of style." She looked around the room, her eyes wild with jealousy. "And then you moved in," she said, pointing at Mark, "with your perfect house, your perfect family, your perfect spectacle. Everyone loved it. Everyone loved you. And I—" She trailed off, burying her face in her hands. "I hated it. I hated how easy it was for you. I hated how much joy it brought everyone. I hated that my house, my neighborhood, was being overshadowed by your brightness." The twist hung in the air, heavy and pathetic. This whole war, the fines, the sabotage, the tyranny, it wasn't about order or property values or the sanctity of the bylaws. It was about jealousy, pure, unadulterated, petty jealousy. Eleanor Grimsby wasn't a principled defender of order. She was just a lonely, insecure woman who couldn't stand the thought of someone else being happier, brighter, more loved than she was. Her beige conformity wasn't a choice. It was a defense mechanism, a way to impose her own limitations on the world around her. If she couldn't create beauty, she would destroy it. The silence in the room was deafening. The absurdity of the situation was overwhelming. They had risked their homes, their savings, their sanity, all because one woman was bad at decorating? Eleanor Grimsby, realizing what she had just confessed, looked up, horrified. She had exposed her weakness, her vulnerability. The mask of the tyrant had slipped, revealing the pathetic reality underneath. She stood up abruptly, knocking over her chair. She grabbed her purse, her face burning with shame, and fled into the clubhouse. She ran out into the night, illuminated by the dazzling lights she had tried so desperately to extinguish. The war was over, and the rebellion had won.
The aftermath of the coup was swift and decisive. The remaining board members, eager to restore peace and goodwill, immediately voted to rescind all fines related to the Christmas light war. Mark Harrison's debt, now totaling over $10,000, was wiped clean. The violation notices issued to the other residents were nullified. The board also approved the exemption for the Christmas light show, recognizing it as a quote-unquote valuable community tradition. The security firm was dismissed, the roadblocks were removed, and the neighborhood was once again open to the public. The celebration that followed was epic. The street turned into a massive block party, with music, food, and laughter echoing through the night. The media returned, this time reporting on the triumph of community spirit over petty tyranny. The Christmas light war became a legend, a cautionary tale for HOAs everywhere. Cedar Creek became a symbol of resistance, a beacon of hope for anyone living under the thumb of a petty tyrant. The neighborhood changed that night. The fear and division that had characterized Eleanor's reign were replaced by a sense of unity and shared purpose. People started talking to each other again, helping each other, looking out for each other. The community, fractured for so long, was finally whole. Mark Harrison, the accidental revolutionary, became a local hero. He was elected to the HOA board in the next election, eventually becoming the president. He spearheaded a reform of the bylaws, stripping away the vague and subjective rules and introducing measures to ensure transparency and accountability. The Christmas light show continued, growing bigger and brighter every year. It became a beloved tradition, drawing visitors from all over the state and raising thousands of dollars for charity. And what of Eleanor? She disappeared. The day after the meeting, a moving truck arrived at her beige house. By nightfall, the house was empty. She left without a word, without a goodbye, swallowed up by the anonymity of the suburbs. Some say she moved to a condo in Florida where the rules were even stricter and the conformity even more absolute. Others say she moved to a remote cabin in the woods, far away from the dazzling lights and the joyful noise of civilization. But she wasn't entirely forgotten. The following Christmas, Mark was setting up his display when he noticed something strange. A small, unlit wreath made of artificial pine cones hung precisely in the center of the front door of Eleanor's old house. The new owners had kept it, a subtle tribute to the woman who had inadvertently brought the neighborhood together. Mark smiled. He looked up at his house, the 50,000 pixels twinkling in the twilight. He thought about the war, the fines, the stress, the absurdity of it all. It had been worth it, every single second of it. He flipped the switch. The house erupted in light. The music swelled, the crowd cheered. The brightest Christmas had begun.
Now, as we wrap this story up, it's worth asking the question, why does this keep happening? Why are HOAs so often magnets for people like Eleanor Grimsby? People obsessed with control, conformity, and the eradication of anything that deviates from their narrow definition of acceptable. The answer lies in the psychology of power and the illusion of control. HOAs are, by design, miniature governments. They have the power to tax, HOA dues, to regulate, the bylaws, and to punish, fines and liens. And for some people, that power is intoxicating. People like Eleanor Grimsby are often deeply insecure individuals. They crave order and predictability because they feel chaotic and uncertain internally. They seek control over their environment because they feel powerless in their own lives. The bylaws become their shield, their weapon, their justification for imposing their will on others. They hide behind the rules, claiming to be objective enforcers of the community standards, while in reality they are driven by their own biases, prejudices, and petty jealousies. Beige conformity is their ideal, because beige is safe, beige is predictable, beige doesn't challenge their worldview or expose their limitations. Joy, on the other hand, is dangerous. Joy is chaotic, spontaneous, excessive. Joy is colorful. And for people like Eleanor Grimsby, joy is a threat. The Christmas light war wasn't just about decorations. It was a clash of worldviews, a battle between the forces of conformity and the forces of creativity, a struggle between the desire for control and the need for community. And it's a battle that is being fought in neighborhoods all across the country. In every HOA, there is a potential Eleanor Grimsby waiting for their chance to impose their will on others. But there is also a potential Mark Harrison, a potential rebellion, a potential army of light. The lesson of Cedar Creek is that community is stronger than control, that unity can overcome tyranny, and that sometimes the only way to fight absurdity is with even greater absurdity. When faced with a Grinch determined to ban Christmas, the answer isn't to dim your lights. The answer is to shine brighter, to band together, to fight back, and to reclaim your right to joy. Because a neighborhood isn't just a collection of houses, it's a community of people. And a community without joy, without celebration, without a little bit of chaos, is just a beige prison.
So, this holiday season, if you find yourself facing an HOA determined to enforce their petty rules, remember Mark Harrison and the Griswold Gorillas. Remember the power of community. And remember that sometimes the only way to win a war on Winter Wonderland is to turn your neighborhood into the brightest spot on the map.
This story, while extreme, highlights the very real tensions that exist in many communities governed by HOAs. The balance between maintaining standards and allowing individual expression is a delicate one, and it's too easy for that balance to tip towards tyranny when the wrong people are in charge. What would you have done in Mark's situation? Would you have taken down the lights to avoid the fines, or would you have joined the rebellion and risked it all? Let me know your thoughts down in the comments. I love reading your perspectives on these crazy situations. Thank you so much for watching this episode of Keys and Chaos. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the Christmas light war, please make sure to give this video a big thumbs up. It truly makes a difference. And if you haven't already, join our amazing community by hitting that subscribe button and turning on all notifications. We have plenty more stories of HOA madness, Karen confrontations, and neighborhood drama coming your way, and you won't want to miss them. Stay safe, stay sane, and keep shining bright. I'll see you in the next video.